Here, I am the law. You think you're testing me. What are you staring at? Want another hit? He roared, slamming the baton onto the table as if to crush the silence itself. Within minutes, he froze, stunned like a statue, when she placed the police chief badge on the table, dried blood still clinging to her collar. He had just struck a black woman, unaware that she was the highest-ranking officer in the entire force. And the price for that ignorance? He would live long enough to taste every bitter inch of it. This wasn't a lesson in restraint. It was a warning, carved in disgrace, meant to echo through every precinct, where arrogance hides behind a badge. He didn't lose control. He revealed who he was when he thought no one was watching. And this time, someone was. Watch to the end, because if you've ever stayed silent in the face of injustice, at least this time, don't look away. The heavy clack of her heels echoed down the tiled hallway as they escorted her toward the final steel door. The cuffs were still cold, as if pulled straight from ice, biting into her swollen wrists. The woman didn't bow her head, nor did she hold it high. Her posture was calm, as if she were the one walking them into the room, not the other way around. Her curly hair was pinned to one side, her red blazer wrinkled, the cuffs stained with dried blood, but she made no move to fix them. Her left eye was bruised, the greenish shadow spreading faintly over her cheekbone. Even so, her gaze was clear, unshaken, so clear that one young officer instinctively stepped aside as he opened the door. Inside the interrogation room, the fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Sergeant Brody sat with his legs crossed on the extra chair, chewing gum loudly, not hiding his contempt. When she walked in, Brody gave a crooked smile, then suddenly threw a stack of files onto the steel table. The dry slap echoed like an added blow to her already bruised face. "What the hell are you dressed like a boss for? Impersonating someone?" he hissed, eyes flicking from her shoulder to her wrist. No name tag, no badge. Brody raised his eyebrows like he'd found a new toy to break without consequence. She didn't respond. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. Gray walls, low ceiling, the camera's red light off, meaning no recording. On the table, a paper cup, a notepad, and Brody's burning glare. She was shoved into the chair across from him. As her body touched the backrest, the scrape of metal legs against tile rang out. Slow but fractured, a small detail, yet keen, the officer leaning against the wall noticed. As if she were controlling every sound her body made, even the act of sitting down was deliberate. Brody spat his gum onto the floor, leaned forward with his elbows on the table. Full name, address. What were you doing in the restricted area? He didn't read her Miranda rights. No search warrant, and he knew it. She glanced at the name Brody crookedly pinned to his chest, then looked away. No words were spoken, but the silence had weight. It wasn't defiance, nor was it submission. It felt like she was waiting for him to reveal himself without needing to interfere. Brody frowned. He hated silence, especially from someone he thought was beneath him. He pressed both palms to the table, growling, "You think you're in charge here? That condescending look only works for politicians, got it? In here, you're a suspect." Not answering, good. Easier to file the report. Keene flipped through a few papers, pretending to be busy to avoid looking at her eyes, but he still couldn't shake the unease inside him. She didn't seem like someone wrongly arrested. No struggling, no pleading, no sign of injustice. She was still, as if she'd prepared for this moment long ago. Brody slammed the table, playing dress-up, hoping to get some priority treatment. "You think anyone's going to believe you're not pretending to be someone?" He leaned in, voice lower but dripping with threat. "I've seen hundreds like you, dark skin, soft voice, big eyes, but in the end, just another act trying to milk the victim card. No one here gives a damn who you are." This time, she tilted her head slightly. The ceiling light highlighted a darker bruise near her temple. She spoke, soft but without a tremble. "And you think you know who I am?" The question came slowly without rising in tone. But in that moment, the air in the room shifted. Brody leaned back as if the air had thickened. Keene turned his head, and for the first time since she entered, the silence no longer belonged to her, it belonged to them. She sat, like every motion had been preset. Not defiant, not obedient, just steady. Her fingers found a misaligned button, pinched it gently, twisted once, and straightened the crease. The fabric had stiffened with blood near the collar, likely from a wound that hadn't yet healed. She didn't look down, did it by feel, as if nothing else could be observed until it was fixed. And when it was, her eyes finally locked onto the man across from her, Sergeant Brody, his face flushed with restrained rage. He watched every small movement with the frustration of someone who couldn't bear the calm in a situation designed to make people lose control. Brody propped his elbows on the table, his wide fingers tapping steadily on the steel surface, as if trying to set a rhythm that would rattle the other side. But that face remained still. He glanced over at Keene, standing in the corner of the room. The young officer hesitated, then broke the heavy silence with a poorly timed question. "You sure you don't want a lawyer?" Keene asked, unsure himself whether it was out of legal duty or conscience. Things were going too far, and the woman in front of them, handcuffed with dried blood still on her collar, didn't resemble anyone he had ever seen in an interrogation room. It wasn't her silence, but the way she made others question why they were even there. Brody scoffed, his crooked grin stretched like a cut from lip to near ear. He repeated a line everyone had heard in movies, but this time it felt terrifyingly real. "In here, I am the law." It wasn't just a statement. It was a claim of dominion, as if this room didn't belong to the department but was his ground, built for enforcing rules that needed no review. The ceiling light flared brighter for a moment, the yellow glow catching Brody's jaw and throwing the twitching lines on his face into sharper relief. Keene turned away. He didn't speak again. There was something stuck in his throat, not quite fear, not quite dissent, just the discomfort of standing between two extremes without knowing where to anchor. He had been trained to stay calm, to back his team, to keep emotion out of the job. But here, in this sealed room, with one man shouting and one bloodied woman holding her ground, Keene wasn't sure what exactly he was supporting. Brody straightened, cleared his throat loudly, then opened the case file. He flipped through a few pages like he was reading, but his eyes never left her face. This time there were no questions, just a pause, deliberately stretched, like the slow drag of a chair meant to torment nerves. But the woman didn't move. She didn't look at him, but at the wall behind, where the ceiling light cast a rectangular patch of brightness on the gray surface, like a warped photo. Brody slammed the file shut on the table, hard enough to send papers flying, but still got no reaction. His voice cracked out, dry. "You think you're testing me?" Still no reply, but something had changed that Brody didn't notice. She had stopped looking at the wall. She was looking at him, and in her eyes there was no hesitation. No distance, only one thing left: control. As if she hadn't been brought into this room but had chosen to walk in long before. "What's your name? Where you from? What were you doing?" Brody growled each word, hands planted on the table, body leaning forward, as if trying to force his presence onto her with both weight and voice. The three questions came out like a burst of gunfire. He expected a familiar reaction. Fluttering eyes, trembling lips, a plea, or at the very least, a glance away. But what he got was entirely different. The woman sat still, back resting squarely against the chair, as if this room were a stage she had mapped out, and Brody was just an extra, fumbling through a role he hadn't learned. Her gaze remained steady, neither tense nor confrontational, but disturbingly calm, as if she was memorizing everything he did. Every word, every movement, every breath, to use when the time was right. It infuriated him. Brody's hand lifted off the table, swinging by instinct like a slapped pea. He had envisioned the moment she stepped through the door. It wasn't a light warning or a show of force. It was deliberate and hard, snapping her face to the left with a sharp crack that echoed through the enclosed space, enough to make Keene on the right flinch at the sound hitting his chest like a recoil. Her left cheek turned a deep red, and a thin line of blood formed along the corner of her mouth. A strand of hair loosened from her bun and fell across her forehead. Yet she didn't lift a hand to touch it, didn't pull back in her seat, didn't look down. She tilted her head slowly back into place, like a broken hinge righting itself, and then, once again, her eyes locked onto Brody's. "What are you planning to do next?" she asked, voice low and warm, a tone that made the question feel dangerous. Brody didn't answer right away. Part of him was stunned by how steady her voice was, but more so he hadn't prepared for what came after, when the person he struck didn't react the way they were supposed to. Keene had been watching everything from the corner, hands clenched tightly behind his back. He had seen interrogations go too far before. Some people cried, some fought back, some collapsed. But never had he seen anyone respond with the voice of someone posing the question. The air in the room thickened, as if every molecule paused to await the next line. Brody yanked the chair behind him and sat down across from her with exaggerated force. He glanced at the open file but didn't read it. He needed to regain control, and in his mind violence was likely the only tool left to prove who was in charge. He placed his hands on the table, thumb tapping in a slow rhythm. One beat, then another. His eye twitched, sweat started to form on his forehead. Even though the room was cooler than the hallway outside, she remained still, breath steady, gaze unwavering. That kind of resolve made no sound, but it made every attempt at dominance look absurd. "Who do you think you are?" Brody hissed again, his voice warped, stripped of any authority it once held. She answered immediately, her voice just loud enough. "I think I'm the only one here who isn't pretending." The air exploded in Brody's head, but this time, instead of lashing out, he froze, as if someone had just crushed his windpipe with a single sentence. Keene turned his face away, his eyes landing on the frosted glass. The first time all day, he wished this room wasn't soundproof, because out there, someone needed to hear what had just been said. Brody planted both hands on the table, exhaling like every passing second was an insult simply because she had the nerve to stay silent. He looked at her like she was a stain that refused to fade, as if her calm was a counterattack that required no weapons. He clenched his teeth, and each word dropped, cold and toxic. "That silence of yours makes me want to puke." It wasn't a question. It was a hit, a calculated, cruel strike from someone too used to forcing control. Oh, but the woman across from him didn't flinch, didn't pull back, didn't harden. Her silence wasn't there to prove a point, but to test Brody himself, to see if he had the control to endure the moment he no longer had it. Keene glanced down at the table. Her hand was clenched next to the file, blood beginning to seep between her fingers. Metal from her cuff may have cut into an old wound. The blood was barely visible under the harsh light, but it left a faint streak on the steel surface, a dark red mark, like the signature of someone sentenced without ever being heard. She looked at the blood with no reaction. Then she raised her eyes again, didn't shift in her seat, didn't slouch, held her posture like her presence in this room was something no power or force could erase. The confrontation didn't come through words or gestures, but through the simple fact that she refused to play the role Brody demanded, a role built on the abuse of authority, where the victim was expected to cower. Brody turned his chair, stood abruptly, and began pacing the room. His usual grip on the situation was slipping. Every step was an attempt to reclaim power that was steadily eroding. He looked at Keene, like he was reaching for backup. "You see this? She's playing me, pulling that holier-than-thou crap like she's not scared of anything, you get that?" Keene didn't answer. In his eyes, the so-called performance Brody mentioned was proving something else. The one putting on a show was the man pacing, sweating, and needing to remind everyone he wasn't falling apart. The woman, bleeding across from them, didn't need to shift a muscle to make the entire room adjust around her. Brody stopped behind her, his hand closing around the baton on his belt. The room thickened with a fresh layer of tension. Keene shifted slightly, about to say something, but stopped. He didn't know what Brody was about to do, and he wasn't sure if he would step in if things crossed the line. But the woman seemed to sense it coming. She tilted her head slightly, didn't look back, and said evenly, "You're losing control, and the worst part is, you know it." Her voice wasn't loud or angry, but the words sliced through the mask of power Brody was clinging to, and he let go of the baton, wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, like it was the heat that had shaken him, not the truth. A drop of sweat hit the tile floor. She still didn't turn around, but her voice came again, clearer this time. "This table doesn't belong to me, but it doesn't belong to you either. The question is, who'll still be sitting here after today?" Brody flinched. For the first time since she walked in, he understood this wasn't an interrogation anymore. This was a shift, and he was sliding into the wrong seat. Keene stepped out of the interrogation room, and the moment the door shut behind him, his heartbeat slowed slightly. The air outside was cooler, but not enough to ease the slow-burning heat rising from within. A suffocating discomfort he couldn't quite name. His hand was still damp with sweat. He pressed the earpiece tightly against his ear, switched to the internal channel, and spoke slowly. "She's not like the others. Look at her eyes." There was a pause on the other end. Then came the hesitant voice of the surveillance officer. "There's an order to keep her separated, but no file is to be logged." The statement was not only vague but dangerous. Keep separated meant close monitoring or high-level intervention. No file implied a form of handling that bypassed the system. Put together, it pointed to a direct order, likely signed by hand, or the kind of silent interference no one on Keene's floor was allowed to touch. He gripped the earpiece cord and cut the feed, eyes fixed on the interrogation room at the end of the hallway. No one had said who she was, but the way the system reacted made it clear this woman wasn't a nobody, and that made everything more complicated. If she held power, why let herself be cuffed? If she was on duty, why not show credentials? Each question only deepened Keene's confusion, and the only certainty he had was that Brody was pushing the situation past the point of no return. He moved toward the monitoring room to verify, but the system was locked at the admin level. The screen displayed reconfiguring settings, which meant someone higher than this floor's commander was watching, or directly intervening. The feeling of being blindfolded inside the system he served made Keene uneasy. Never before had someone he interrogated triggered silent oversight from the control center. Even federal cases came with internal tags and classification codes. But this file was blank except for one cryptic note: "Observe, but do not interrupt." Keene left the control station, walking more slowly back down the hallway. Each step toward that room seemed to thicken the air. He paused at the door, hand resting on the latch, but not turning it. Through the frosted glass, he saw Brody pacing with the baton in hand, and the woman still seated, unchanged in expression and posture. Between them hung a silence, filled with things unspoken but dangerous. He turned away, heading toward the command office. The door was shut. Inside, the administrative assistant typed without looking up, brow furrowed. Keene tapped the desk gently. "Has anyone from higher up issued orders about the last interrogation? I couldn't find the subject's file, only a priority tag and a removal from standard protocol." The assistant looked up, eyes flashing as if he'd touched a line that shouldn't be crossed. "I think you should stop there. If she's not in the system, then she's not under your jurisdiction." Keene bit his lip. The quieter they were, the more they knew. He walked out of the office with a single question in mind: who has the authority to do that? And if she was truly under high-level observation, then everything happening in that room, every insult, every strike, was likely being recorded somewhere Brody couldn't erase. Keene looked back at the door latch like a soldier before a restricted zone, not out of fear, but because he knew, from this moment on, whatever happened inside that room would not end there. Brody quietly shut the door behind him after Keene left the room. He let out a long breath, as if releasing himself from the burden of the man who had just been standing beside him. The room narrowed down to just the two of them, and he quickly stepped toward the table, adjusting the chair with one hand, his eyes never leaving the woman seated across from him. He tilted his head, squinted, then hissed through his teeth with calculated force. "I'll teach you who makes the decisions in here." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a sentence being passed. That line wasn't meant to extract information. It was a blow, a warning, a power move from someone who had long treated silence as surrender. The woman tilted her head slightly, and her gaze was no longer just cold observation. It had shifted into something selectively confrontational. Her left cheek was still bruised, a red mark running from her cheekbone to her jaw. It was the trace of his earlier action, but when she spoke, her voice bore no resemblance to someone who had just been struck. "Do you know who signed today's transfer order?" The question came out short, clear, and completely devoid of challenge. If anything, it sounded earnest, like she was reminding him of routine paperwork from an ordinary day. Brody paused, just a beat, but long enough for a flicker of confusion to ripple through his eyes. Then he laughed, a harsh sound laced with mockery and defiance. "I don't care what the paper says. In here, paper doesn't control me." He leaned in against the table, hands planted like someone ready to launch into another round of verbal assault. She didn't pull back, didn't lower her head. She stayed seated, back straight, hands resting lightly on her thighs, her gaze level with his. Neither higher nor lower. That posture couldn't be faked. No one held themselves like that in a room thick with the heat of muscle tension and the stench of sweat from someone who always struck first. He repeated the question, this time with a growl in his tone. "Who signed it?" She paused a few seconds, then answered in a voice both low and even. "I did." A twitch sparked at the corner of Brody's eye. He looked up, thrown off balance for an instant. "What did you say?" She didn't repeat it. She simply slipped loose a cord inside her cuff, the fold she had adjusted earlier. From it, the edge of a badge emerged, not large, not shiny, but the silver-lined border and embossed symbol were enough for someone in the field to recognize it immediately. He didn't touch it, didn't move closer. His eyes scanned it once more, then locked back on her face. His gaze no longer screamed. It retreated on instinct. He knew that badge. He knew who had issued one, and he knew that with someone carrying that type of credential, no second verification was ever needed. His silence brought her no satisfaction. She didn't smirk, didn't wear a victorious smile. She simply rebuttoned the cuff covering the badge, as if she didn't need it to end the conversation. Her hand closed, thumb tucking the fabric neatly into the crease. Brody swallowed hard. Sweat soaked the collar of his shirt. The room was still quiet, but the silence no longer belonged to him. She placed her hand on the table, her voice steady as it had been from the start. "I didn't come here to prove anything. I sat in this chair to see how long it would take for the system you trust to reveal itself." Brody circled behind her chair, eyes fixed on the edge of her sleeve where part of a badge had just been revealed. The fragile restraint in her voice earlier made him cautious, like a predator second-guessing bait that seemed too easy. He bent down and yanked open the zipper of the leather bag slung beside her without warning. The metallic rasp of the zipper sounded like a secret being forced open by someone who had no right to touch it. Inside there was no wallet, no phone, only a document folder and a small rectangular leather case. He opened the lid, his hand trembling slightly. The ceiling light shone directly onto the object inside. A recessed badge gleamed faintly, edged in silver, a 5-pointed star embossed at its center, with a cold, bold line beneath it. Restricted ID. Command authority. His breath caught. His hand recoiled half a step by reflex. A phrase slipped out of his mouth before he could stop it. "What the hell?" Then, as if to salvage a shred of authority, he muttered another line, lowering his voice in a poor attempt to maintain control. "Fake, huh? You people sure know how to stage a show." She stayed still, as if she had already anticipated the entire sequence of his reaction. There was a glint of cold analysis in her eyes, the look of someone who had seen this play out too many times to be surprised. Brody's actions didn't shake her. If anything, they confirmed that he had started to touch something he neither understood nor could control. Brody turned to Keene, who had just returned to the doorway, eyes alert. "You see that? Organized fraud, reprinted badge, even nailed the federal layout." He spoke louder than necessary, as if trying to gather support for a story he hadn't yet lost control of. Keene didn't respond. He stepped closer, eyes fixed on the badge in Brody's hand. His gaze tightened. The serial markings were deep, The font was non-standard issue. Most telling of all was the registration number etched along the edge, a detail any federally trained officer would know signified a command-level credential, the kind that required no scan and was always stored in a coded case under regional authority protocols. He glanced at her face and, for the first time, noticed something the ceiling light hadn't fully revealed until now. Nestled at her red collar was an embedded insignia, raised stitching and dark thread bordered in black. He had been trained to recognize that symbol. If seen, the bearer needed no ID. The system would match her identity automatically through secured clearance levels. Brody didn't get it. He placed the badge back in the leather case, but still held it tightly, as if debating whether to throw it to the floor. So what, this is real? A woman held in an interrogation room, no name, no record, and she's got something like this? She stood up, slowly, firmly, without waiting for permission. The metal chair made a short sound, but there was no clink of chains or shuffling. She stepped toward Brody, eyes steady, voice direct. I was deployed under a National Defense Priority Code. The order came in this morning. They kept the file off the system for security reasons, but it looks like you just wrote your name into it. The words landed in Brody's palm like a heavy stone, one he couldn't decide whether to hold or drop. The arrogance in his eyes had retreated, replaced with something closer to anger, tinged with fear, because he knew people with that level of authority never repeated themselves, and any action taken past the line would be retrieved, logged, and judged on a level he had no defense against. Brody still gripped the badge case in his hand, as if he couldn't quite believe that the small piece of metal could overturn his authority. His lips were pressed tight, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, but he kept his back straight, trying to reassemble the authority that had started to crack the moment she opened her mouth. She didn't speak again, didn't argue, didn't reach for the badge. Her silence no longer carried the weight of endurance. It had become a quiet warning, sharper than any rebuttal. Her eyes no longer waited, they watched, not for someone to come to her rescue, but to see how far Brody would push himself before he realized where the true boundary lay. The door swung open again. Keene walked in, his face no longer clouded with uncertainty. He moved directly to the table, a lit phone in his hand. Without looking at Brody or asking permission, he placed the device in front of her and said, "Someone from the command office is calling. They want to speak with you." Brody froze. His eyes locked onto the screen, as if trying to catch a trick. But the line of text displayed left no room for doubt. Office of Regional Command, Level 1. Off. He stepped back, reaching as if to grab the phone, but Keene had already positioned himself in the way. She didn't rush to answer. Her hand brushed the table surface, as if measuring each reflection off the cold steel. When she picked up the phone, the motion was so decisive that no one dared interrupt. Rivers speaking. Her voice was clear, low, not loud, but strong enough to make both men in the room fall silent. Brody's fist tightened, and the only sound in his head was the collapse of every layer of power he once thought he could control. The name just spoken, Rivers, was no longer a mystery. Every internal report over the past month had mentioned a new commander being reassigned to the region. But Brody had never imagined that among the upper ranks there would be someone like her, dark-skinned, deep-eyed, and with a gaze sharp enough to cut deeper than any command ever issued in this room. The call was short, only a few confirmations. She said yes, then understood, and once, no further intervention needed. When she hung up, no one moved. The air felt thinner, replaced by the slow rise of something about to break, something everyone had heard coming but didn't yet know where it would split. She handed the phone back to Keene, her gaze no longer cold but firm. "We will proceed by protocol," she said, with no emphasis on any word, yet each one landing exactly where it had the most weight. Brody let out a dry laugh, the kind of laugh from someone who had run out of moves, but wasn't ready to step away. This was a setup, wasn't it? This whole act was to humiliate me. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the left side of his chest, where the SGT Brody patch was stitched slightly off from regulation placement. Her eyes paused there like a mark being logged, then lifted. "I don't need to set anyone up. You chose your path, step by step." Keene didn't speak, but stood straighter, as if finally understanding something he hadn't been sure of before. She hadn't come to prove Brody wrong. She came to see if anyone in the room dared to correct it before it was exposed in a way that couldn't be undone. In that moment, for the first time in an interrogation that had stretched over an hour, Brody didn't respond with words. Only the sound of the chair behind him being dragged back, gently bumping the wall, then going still, like an unwilling witness left to watch the rest unfold. The voice from the phone's speaker cut across the room like a blade slicing through the last remnants of arrogance. "Madam Chief, does the current situation require state-level intervention?" The question was brief and direct, with emphasis landing squarely on the two words that froze the air, Madam Chief. It didn't need repeating. That title alone flipped the room's entire hierarchy. The one seated became the absolute superior. The one who thought he controlled the interrogation plummeted from a position he believed unshakable. Brody froze. His throat went dry like he had just swallowed a rock. He snapped his head toward Keene, as if hoping the voice had been a system glitch, some kind of audio prank. But Keene's expression offered no such escape. The young officer stood still, gaze lowered in a way only someone who had fully recognized the true authority of the other could carry. She lifted one finger to her lips, saying nothing. The gesture wasn't protective or theatrical. It was a command, silence. And what terrified Brody most was that he understood. No yelling, no barked orders, no slammed tables or grabbed collars. Yet the entire room fell into obedient stillness, as if awaiting a verdict from the highest authority. The voice on the other end resumed, slower now, measured with bureaucratic weight, but still carrying urgency. "All internal channels are under surveillance. Priority code verification has been completed. We are awaiting final response from the on-site commanding officer." She glanced at Brody, who had instinctively stepped aside, both hands braced on the table, like he needed something to hold on to. But even the table couldn't save him now. Everything had shifted too fast. The slap, the insults, the bag search he once thought of as control tactics, all of it now sat squarely in legal jeopardy, the kind that could end his career on the spot. She nodded slightly, then pressed the reply button. "No further intervention needed. I have control of the situation. All records will be finalized on site." Her voice was calm, not domineering. It was the tone of someone who held full authority and understood the weight behind every word. Brody stepped back half a pace, fingers scratching nervously at his collar. The uniform felt tighter. Sweat clung to his spine, the damp fabric sticking like a second skin made of failure. Keene remained still, gaze drifting from her to Brody, then to the command authority badge on the table, which had been a battleground of control only moments ago. There was no doubt now. The roles were set. No one could pretend otherwise. She turned to Keene. "Thank you for bringing in the phone. You should step out for a moment." It wasn't dismissal, it was leadership. Delivered gently, precisely, with no room for anyone to be pulled into a humiliation not meant for them. Keene nodded and left without a word. The door clicked shut behind him with just enough weight to mark the change in authority. Inside, Brody remained, back damp, eyes dulling with the realization that no words would save him now. No one was forcing him to speak, and that was the cruelest part. The silence no longer belonged to the interrogated, but to the man now facing the collapse of everything he once believed unshakable. She kept the phone to her ear for a few more seconds, eyes fixed on Brody, who stood suspended between confusion and a bitterness too fresh to name. Her voice was steady, each word landing cleanly in the thick air. "No need, I have a few more minutes here." The sentence sliced through the last threads of Brody's reliance on a familiar system. It didn't ask permission, it didn't negotiate, it was a decision, and it came from someone with the power to make it, a truth Brody had never prepared to face. She ended the call and placed the phone on the table with a touch so light it made no sound. Immediately after, her other hand moved to her coat, pulled gently, and withdrew the badge that had remained hidden since the beginning. There was nothing showy in her movements, but every detail was executed with the clarity of a performance designed to end a long-standing misunderstanding. The badge caught the ceiling light, silver-edged with an engraved serial code, pressed into a matte metal base. She set it on the table and pushed it slightly toward Brody, as if returning to him the old question, "Who do you think you are?" Brody stared at the badge, arms hanging limp at his sides, his cheekbones flushed red, unclear if from anger or the rush of blood caused by humiliation. In that moment, he had no idea how to react. Ask again? Deny it? Slam his hand on the table and accuse her of faking it? Every method he had used over the years on the job was now useless, because the person sitting across from him held an authority he couldn't outrank, couldn't challenge, and most importantly, couldn't explain away. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. Action had done what words couldn't. Brody turned his face away as if to escape the weight of the name that had just surfaced, but her eyes followed even his smallest movement. She wasn't watching to overpower, but to make sure he understood that this time there would be no brushing it off, no shifting the blame. Outside the room, the hallway was silent. No footsteps, no hurried office calls. Everything seemed to wait for a single sound to end one scene and start the next. Keene did not return, and that might have been the only right decision he made all morning. Brody reached for the badge but stopped when his fingertip was less than an inch away. There was an invisible line between him and the object lying still on the table, a thin piece of metal, yet inside it lay the gap between illusion and reality, between the man who once believed he had the right to decide and the woman who never needed to raise her voice to prove she already held that right. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze cooled, but no less weighty. Her voice came for the first time since placing the badge down. "I used to think this system was broken because of a few people. Now I see the real damage is from those who believe they never need to double-check themselves." Brody swallowed hard. Everything in his head unraveled. Years of training to control situations, to command questions, to steer reactions. Now just a pile of useless theory. Across from him sat a woman who had been beaten, searched, insulted, and now sat upright, delivering the verdict without needing a single sheet of paper. She closed the badge case, pulled it back toward her, then stood up. The movement was so quiet that the chair didn't make a sound. As she walked toward the door, every step sent a ripple that made Brody instinctively step back. No one had given him an order, but it was clear he understood he had stepped into a space where every movement would be remembered. Not by cameras, but by the memory of someone who would never let it happen again. The door swung open once more, this time not with the usual slow pace of the administrative wing. A man in military uniform stepped in, his left shoulder still marked by the imprint of a radio, his forehead soaked in sweat, and his hand gripping the door frame as though he had just run down the hallway. The administrative lieutenant of the command center, a man known for rarely appearing in direct situations, now stood there, breathless, his face so alarmed that he could no longer maintain his usual calm demeanor. He glanced around the room, his gaze pausing only for 3 seconds on Brody before turning back to the woman sitting at the table. "Chief Rivers, they didn't know. I'm sorry." This apology wasn't directed at any specific action. It was the kind of apology that arises when someone realizes that what should have been stopped long ago has now spiraled out of control. It doesn't matter who called him here, nor does it matter when he learned of the situation. His mere presence in the interrogation room proved 2 things. The system had acknowledged its wrongdoing, and she no longer needed to speak for herself. She stood up, unhurried. Her left hand rested on the table to steady herself, while her right arm reflexively pulled back, dragging a fresh streak of red across the sleeve of her jacket. The old blood stain on her wrist grazed the edge of the chair, spreading into a new patch, soaking deeper into the fabric. She didn't wipe it off. She didn't avoid it. No one needed to express any sympathy. The wound was real, and in the thick atmosphere of denial and regret, the blood needed no justification. Brody moved slightly, his heel dragging with a soft sound across the tile, his head lowered more than before. He didn't say a word. Any words would have been redundant. He couldn't erase the image of himself in the lieutenant's eyes, nor could he justify his actions with an excuse that would make it palatable. He knew the moment the senior officer addressed her as chief, every attempt at defense turned into a confession. The lieutenant stepped forward a few paces, pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, and extended it toward her. but she gently raised her hand to decline. He hesitated, then retracted his hand, his eyes fixed on the blood that had spread across the 2 layers of stitching. His face gradually shifted to an expression of discomfort, not because of embarrassment, but because he understood that he was standing in a moment where late help would have no value. "We were not informed you would arrive this early," he said more slowly, his gaze briefly meeting Keen's, as if to remind him this was not everyone's fault. "The coordination room was given a code-level security clearance, but didn't properly implement the supervision tiers as initially instructed." Rivers nodded, her eyes leaving Brody's to meet the commanding officers directly. "I came to assess the situation firsthand. No one is at fault for not knowing who I am, but I need to know if anyone chose not to know." That statement silenced the room once again. But this time it wasn't a threat. It was a direct request, made with clarity, without raising her voice, without gestures, without coercion. A form of authority granted, but also forged through every encounter with failure, without relying on a title to find an escape. The lieutenant nodded, but he knew well that his apology would not be recorded, while her blood would be. Brody took a step back. His shoulders slumped, while Keen stood as if held back by something greater than an order, perhaps the trust just restored, or the nameless shame that had just been awakened. She turned to the lieutenant, not asking for anything further. She simply looked at him as though to confirm that those who are right never need to say much, and those who are wrong don't get many chances to speak again. Brody stood frozen in the middle of the room, as if the tiled floor beneath him had cracked without warning. His arms hung loose, his eyes flicking between her and the badge on the table. His throat was dry, as if he had swallowed an entire night packed with unfinished dreams. Sweat dotted his temples, but he didn't dare lift a hand to wipe it. Everything around him seemed to have shifted into an order where he was no longer the center. "No way, his voice broke. Each syllable dragged from a place long left untouched. The sentence stopped halfway, stuck between a delayed realization and a belief long ground down into illusion. He didn't dare finish the thought, and there was no word accurate enough to fill the space without dragging him deeper into the abyss of lost control. She turned, her gaze slowly passing over his face. There was no anger, no satisfaction, just a clarity that made every excuse feel out of place. Her voice was light, like a breeze through a hallway, but it carried the full weight of the room. "I was appointed this morning, and I have the authority to choose where I sit. Unfortunately, you chose wrong." The sentence landed like a final period, non-negotiable. The room held no sound except the steady hum of the air conditioning in the corner. Keen, now standing near the door, turned his face away on instinct. He didn't want to see the moment a man who once believed he was untouchable fractured under the weight of truth. That feeling didn't bring satisfaction. It brought reckoning. He had stayed silent when he wasn't sure what was happening. Now it was all too clear, and silence had become the most difficult thing to maintain. Brody exhaled sharply, trying to find his voice, but only managed a faint grunt from deep in his throat. His eyes went blank for a second, then darted around the room like searching for an escape, as if the walls were closing in, inch by inch. Until now, he had always believed this room was under his command. The lighting, the furniture, the words, even the fear. But for the first time, none of it responded to his presence. It had shifted allegiance. She walked back to the table and picked up the badge without haste. Her fingers brushed the dust off the edges, as if wiping away the illusions that had just clung to it. Then she slipped the case into her pocket, the motion discreet, as if true authority never needed to remain visible for long. It only needed to appear at the right time, then vanish, leaving every remaining gaze to realign on its own. The administrative lieutenant stood to one side, quietly jotting something into his notebook. No one had told him to do it, but he understood. After today, no previous report would be enough to describe what had just happened, and this system would have to relearn how to right itself from the beginning. She turned to Brody one final time. "This place used to be for people who thought they didn't need to control their emotions. that you forgot that the person ultimately responsible isn't the one who yells the loudest. Brody lowered his head, his hand clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white, but this time, no one stopped him. This collapse didn't require intervention because it came from the original choice to impose instead of observe. And when a person refuses to look straight at something, the moment truth appears, they are the only ones left with no place to stand. The internal meeting room that afternoon was not crowded. Most of the people present had already heard the news before entering. Sergeant Brody's suspension order was signed directly by the acting senior commander and was effective immediately. This was the first time in the history of the local police department that such a decision was made without going through the council process, without intermediary opinions, and without waiting for proposals from the Internal Affairs Department. The voice reading the order sounded monotonous, each word typed out with certainty. For violation of conduct standards and, more seriously, for deliberately infringing upon the inviolable rights of a federal-level officer performing their duties in the area, Sergeant Michael Brody is hereby suspended immediately, unconditionally, until a final decision is reached by the Internal Federal Oversight Board. As the last line was read, the room fell silent. The atmosphere in the room felt like a pressure chamber. Every gaze exchanged carried the question of why this had not happened sooner. Brody was not present during the reading of the order. He was instructed to leave the headquarters as soon as the papers were signed, without carrying a weapon or his badge. He was told to exit quietly, through a side door, without his boots, without his uniform, and his face no longer resembled the image that had once appeared during award ceremonies. It was like a building had its nameplate removed overnight, and no one cared to look back. After the meeting, Keene requested a private conversation. He gently knocked on the door of the temporary command office where Rivers was working. She looked up when she saw him, giving a small nod for him to enter. No one sat down. The conversation took place while they both stood, less than a step apart. Keene stopped, his eyes dropping to the floor before lifting again. I didn't know how to stop him. I was afraid of being seen as a traitor. Rivers didn't respond immediately. She let his words hang in the air between them. Only after a brief pause did she speak in a steady, slow voice. Betrayal is not in speaking the wrong thing. It begins when you know something is wrong and still choose to stay silent. Keene nodded, his lips pressed tight, as though holding back something he had prepared to say, but which now seemed unnecessary. He didn't say he regretted it. He didn't apologize. He didn't cite the pressures of the system or the hierarchy. He simply stood there, like someone who had just stepped out of their blindness, not knowing which direction to take next. She walked to the desk, pulling a thin file from a drawer. The name on the first page was his. The line beneath read, "Reassignment potential, pending evaluation after Brody incident." She handed the file to him and said, "I haven't signed it yet. If you want to keep this position, the first thing you need to do is not try to convince me. You need to decide how you will react when something like this happens again." Keene held the file with both hands, his gaze fixed on his name printed on the cover. He knew this wasn't a warning. This was an opportunity. A rare chance to step out of the secondary role trapped in the power game and to stand in the position of someone who could change the outcome of a situation, even if it was just with the right words at the right time. He left the room without saying another word, but his steps were heavier than when he entered. Not from regret, but because for the first time he felt the true weight of having been given the power of choice. And in a system that had once operated through silence, that choice could very well be the only thing left that preserved dignity. She stood silently before the frosted window, the last light of the day casting a long shadow across the floor. Keene still stood in the doorway, tightly holding the unsigned file, his eyes seemingly waiting for some form of forgiveness. But when she turned back, there was no judgment. Her face was calm to the point that those facing her didn't know whether to feel relieved or uneasy. "I don't blame you," she said, her voice not loud but clear. "The one who hits must answer to the law, but the one who sees it happen and does nothing deserves even more questions." That line carried no bitterness, And it wasn't said to punish, it was like a mirror placed between two people, not to reflect the past, but to confront the present. And in that moment, Keene understood that what breaks a person isn't the blow, but the time they spent watching it land without moving. That same afternoon, the tech team recovered a segment of footage from the internal camera. The surveillance equipment had partially malfunctioned due to a maintenance setup error, but the data had been stored on a backup server that no one had noticed. When the screen came to life, the interrogation room appeared. Harsh lighting, Brody blocking the camera's view of her, then the slap, the swing, the slam of the table. Frame by frame, the footage didn't just restore actions. It revealed the full truth, warped by the original report. The monitoring room felt breathless. The youngest technician, just 8 months into the job, glanced toward Rivers. Her expression didn't shift. She simply signaled to save the footage under command-level encryption and told the department lead, "Don't release it." A surprised voice rose from behind. "But with this evidence, you could get everyone on your side. They'd sympathize." She shook her head, stepped toward the control desk, her eyes stopping exactly on the running timeline. "I don't need sympathy. I need the truth." That short reply ended all debate. To her, the truth didn't need embellishment. It didn't need a spotlight, didn't need to go viral. It just needed to exist, to be acknowledged, and, most importantly, to lead to real change. If the system were to fix itself, it had to do so not from pressure, but from the recognition that error is something that cannot be negotiated. That evening, she called a closed-door meeting with the mid-level oversight team. She didn't talk about the slap, and she didn't mention the video. Instead, she asked each person, "Next time, if it's you walking into that room, what would you do differently?" Not everyone answered right away. A few avoided her gaze. Some sat up straighter and gave small, deliberate nods. But in those eyes, she saw what she needed. Not submission, but the first signs of a civil service willing to question itself. When the meeting ended, she returned to her office without turning on the lights. In the dark, her face remained calm, but inside she knew. Every decision made today wasn't just about handling one person. It was a test for the entire system, its ability to face what it had long chosen to ignore. And when no one could say, "I didn't know," anymore, silence would no longer be a shield. It would become evident. The young officer stepped in, her stride firm enough not to interrupt, yet still betraying a hint of tension. She placed an old, faded photograph on the table next to a stack of files that had not been opened yet. No introduction, no accompanying notes. But the recipient immediately understood. This was not something to be stored away. The man in the photograph was Brody, a few years younger, but still with that surly expression, still with the habitual hand gesture of choking someone, a familiar act for someone who had done it many times. But the person being controlled was different, their face obscured by shadows and the angle of the shot. She turned the photo around, searching for any ink marks or serial numbers, but found nothing. There were no records linking this incident, despite a thorough search through various systems. It was as if it had never existed, or someone had made it that way on purpose. "This photo," the officer said softly. "I found it in an old training file wedged between 2 evaluation pages. It's not part of any investigative department." She nodded, but didn't respond. But in her mind, possibilities began to form. She had dealt with forged files before, had faced systems willing to erase data just to protect a few names. But this was different, not because it was hidden so well, but because someone had assumed no one would ever look for it. She quietly accessed the internal storage system, entered a keyword matching the estimated time of the photograph. A series of files appeared, but most were locked with administrative codes. Only those at the highest command level could open them. She entered her access code. The words "access granted" flashed on the screen, and disconnected fragments of information began to piece together. 6 years ago, an internal report was written about an act of unauthorized handling, without confirming the identity of the subject. The author was a reserve officer, their name no longer displayed, but the description referred to the incident in the photo. The person being restrained had never been identified, and there was no supporting evidence. But strangely, the incident had not been deleted. It had only been moved to the pending further investigation category, then faded into silence. She turned to look at the photo again. The restrained individual seemed to be wearing a hospital gown. Their left wrist had a plastic band. Someone who should not have been in custody, or perhaps should not have been at the headquarters. She expanded the search and accessed the list of patients admitted to the station during that time. Only one name had a mismatched birth date. No one corrected it. That person later died in a psychiatric facility, 2 weeks after the temporary transfer, with no detailed report. She read to the last line of the file, then looked up, her eyes fixed on the space behind the window. Not out of surprise, but out of anger. What Brody had done yesterday was not the first time, and if these things were not brought to light, it would not be the last. She placed the photo back on the table, at the edge like an incomplete piece of evidence. But this time, she didn't hand it to anyone. She would keep it, not to force guilt, but to wait for an answer worthy of the truth. The truth was not in the photos or the files. It lay in the choices that had been ignored, and this time, no one would have the right to overlook it. The news was not publicly announced, there was no press conference, no media release, but somehow those who had been wronged knew exactly where to go. They didn't carry banners or cameras, they came in silence, with an old file, a few yellowed photographs, a copy of a rejected application, and eyes that had grown too weary waiting for justice. The oldest woman among them placed a thick envelope on the secretary's desk, then stepped back, leaving no real name. Inside was the transcript of an interrogation from more than 8 years ago, signed by Brody and the scrawled handwriting of the victim, with a note. Forced to write, according to the template, I do not agree with this statement. In less than 1 week, more than a dozen people submitted documents to headquarters. No one made public statements on social media, no one called for an investigation or expressed outrage online. They simply came at the scheduled time to the right door and left behind only one thing, evidence that they had once been ignored. A few walked out of the lobby quietly, their expressions indifferent, as if what they had just done didn't matter. But to the woman sitting on the top floor, where the window faced the flagpole directly, those folders were not just accusations. They were the first bricks in rebuilding what generations of police chiefs had tried to construct with empty promises. The closed meeting was held in a small room, with no reporters, no cameras. Those invited were key personnel, the ones who had directly overseen or processed citizen complaints over the past 10 years. She entered without an introduction, without a speech. In her hand was a single file, not even 3 centimeters thick, yet heavy enough to shift the way everyone in the room saw their chairs. She placed the file on the table, then looked around. No one spoke first. The air thickened, as if awaiting a verdict. We don't rebuild trust with PR, she said slowly, each word clear. We do it by taking down the signs we've put up to blind the public. She didn't need to explain which signs. Everyone understood. The performance scoreboards plastered along the corridors, the posters praising exemplary conduct while complaint files sat untouched, the commitment boards against violence that never addressed the actual content of the reports. Someone in the room asked quietly, "What about those still working, despite being named in complaints?" She looked directly at him without flinching. "They will be reviewed, but this time not based on years of service or a cleaned-up disciplinary record. We will start again with what the people said." No one objected, but some began to lower their heads, not out of shame, but with the understanding that the era of avoidance had come to an end. The meeting ended without applause or praise, but as everyone left, no one forgot the handwritten message she had left on the board. Justice doesn't begin with law. It begins with the courage to reread the letters we once ignored. The words weren't sharp, but they kept many awake that night, because they weren't directed at any one person. They were meant for all who had once believed silence could preserve the image of an entire system. He left the office on a quiet morning, without a word of farewell. On the old desk, once cluttered with patrol reports and leave requests, there was only a light brown envelope with a handwritten note. To the successor, or to the one brave enough to not be like me. No one saw Keene leave the building. The cameras couldn't capture the moment he left the parking lot, but everyone knew that decision did not come from fear. It came from the only thing left after everything else: conscience. The letter was delivered to the police chief's office at the end of the workday. She opened it and read slowly, as though reading a testimony, not to condemn, but to understand how one goes from silence to action. I haven't hurt anyone. I've never pointed a gun at anyone, but I've let them be beaten, coerced, humiliated, and I didn't step in. And that, for me, is now the greatest betrayal. Not the betrayal of the department, but the betrayal of what I thought I stood for. Protection. Each sentence seemed to cut straight into the place no one dared touch in hearings or training sessions. There was nothing glamorous in the confession, but it was precisely in its cold simplicity that she could not ignore it. She didn't reach out. She didn't call Keene back, but instead of filing the letter away, she placed it in a new folder, along with a small note that read, "This is what must be learned." And she didn't send it to the disciplinary department. She sent it directly to the Officer Training Academy, where young people are first asked about the line between obeying orders and maintaining dignity. The folder was sealed with a green cover, with no author's name, no political commentary. But in every class, it would be read before they began their training on the right to control, and it would be the only part without a right answer, only the question, have you ever stayed silent when you should have spoken up? That decision wasn't to honor Keene. It was to remind everyone that sometimes silence kills more than a punch. In the first curriculum meeting after the materials were delivered, a veteran instructor asked, "Are we sure the trainees are mature enough to take in this confession?" The coordinator simply replied, "If they are not mature enough to face this truth, then they are not mature enough to wear the badge." A month later, in the corner of the first classroom, using the new curriculum, a young trainee stood up after the discussion hour and asked the instructor softly, "If later on I see something wrong, but I'm not sure enough to react, what should I do?" That question wasn't in the skill set. It wasn't in the standard response model. But the instructor just placed his hand on the folder and said, "You may not react right away, but if you choose to hold on to it, to write it down, so that someone after you can see it, then you've chosen not to turn away." In that way, Keene's letter didn't close the career of an officer. It opened the first chapter for a new generation, a generation taught that courage is not always a grand action. Sometimes it is the decision to stand up, step forward, and write down what one had once silently ignored. The morning session announcing the new council did not take place in a grand auditorium. There were no cameras, no polished banners or slogans about reform, just a long table in the center of an empty meeting room, where 12 chairs had been arranged and sealed envelopes were placed precisely in front of each seat. They were not officers. No one came from the former command unit. There were no media consultants, no departmental attorneys, no familiar names on the list. She had made the requirement clear in advance. This council must be selected from outside the force. Anyone who's ever been on a police payroll, disqualified. At the head of the table sat a professor of criminal justice policy from a public university. Next to him was a nurse who had treated victims of police violence in the emergency room. There was also a minister, an investigative journalist, and a mother who had lost her child in an abuse of power case. None of them brought glossy briefcases or complex charts, but they all carried memories, hard to accept but impossible to ignore. She didn't arrive late, nor early. She entered the room just as the facilitator was giving the opening remarks. Placing her hand on the table, she looked at each person. There was no prepared speech, no declaration of lofty goals or promises of change. She simply pulled a small sheet of paper from her pocket, smoothed it out, and read in an even tone. I don't want this council's final report to be something filed away and forgotten. I don't want it to be a polished story for the press. I ask only one thing. Do not change names. If someone did wrong, write their full name. If someone gave the wrong order, record their title. And if there's not enough evidence for a charge, state clearly that there was suspicion but insufficient proof. But under no circumstances should names be replaced with ID numbers or initials. Changing names erases half the truth. A pause settled in after that statement. The young mother nodded first, followed by the professor. The facilitator flipped the sheet in front of him, copying down every word without adjusting a single phrase. That rule, seemingly small, was the first break in a pattern of procedural shielding. In past disciplinary reports, those who committed violations were often listed only by file number, and names appeared only if a court had formally convicted them. But now, the change wasn't starting from verdicts. It was beginning with how things were named when no one had dared to name them before. The council worked without time pressure. She did not interfere with the process, but each time they sent a case file to her office, she requested the unaltered version as well. Unedited, unabridged. She wasn't waiting for a flawless conclusion. She was waiting for verifiable honesty. Some had objected that this approach might violate privacy or endanger individuals. She responded during a hearing, "The name a victim remembers is not a number. It's a face, a voice, a slur burned into memory, so the system has no right to erase names when it never erased the bruises." That council did not become a symbol, they did not appear on television, but their first report, 300 pages thick, was released directly to the public with the names of all involved printed clearly, not capitalized to soften the impact. In a society long used to seeing misconduct through statistics and internal review percentages, saying the right name was a quiet revolution. And sometimes that alone is enough to make those calculating wrongdoing reconsider their next move. The third-floor lobby of the temporary headquarters was not adorned with a tall wooden podium nor a microphone pointed at the face of someone meant to be honored. Instead, there was just a whiteboard hastily mounted on the wall, silently. The reporters stood scattered in a semicircle, each taking notes either by machine or by hand. And standing among them, in a shirt with sleeves rolled up past the elbows, was the woman who had been handcuffed in the interrogation room just days before, now officially appointed as the new police chief. She didn't smile. She didn't use grandiose words. She simply looked around the room, then placed her hand on the edge of the whiteboard and said firmly, "I am not here to be a heroine. I do not represent a victory." Her voice rang clear, not needing a microphone, as there was no loudspeaker here to drown out the real message. She took a step to the left, grabbed a marker, and wrote 2 large words on the board: responsibility and a reaction. Then she turned back and continued. "Someone asked me if I felt ashamed when I was treated like that and still stayed calm, not screaming, not reacting. I don't think shame is the right word, because shame doesn't lie with the person who was beaten. It lies with the one doing the beating. And worse, with the one who saw it and still turned away." A young reporter raised their hand, seemingly about to ask something, but she gestured for them to wait. She didn't need any noise right now. Her gaze was direct, cutting through the invisible defenses of her audience. "I was beaten, but I'm not standing here today to recount it as proof of endurance. I'm standing here to remind you, and to remind those watching this at home, that what needs to be remembered is not who endured. It's who did it, and who allowed it to happen." The atmosphere grew tight, like a taut rope at the edge of avoidance. One cameraman silently lowered his camera, not because the battery was dead, but because, in that moment, the frame no longer seemed the most important thing. She didn't stop there. She named 3 officers who had sent internal emails of apology after the incident, but hadn't intervened when it occurred. She read each name, each position, each word they wrote, without adding or subtracting. I don't need them to be hated. I need society to understand that regret afterward is never enough to erase initial responsibility. Silence is also an act with consequences. Then she returned to the whiteboard, writing one more line: real space. She looked toward the reporters, her voice lower but sharper than steel. I don't need a pretty story. I need space for the truth to exist without distortion. If anyone wants to frame me as a symbol to soothe anger, then stop right here. There was something in the way she stood firm in that simple room that made people understand. This was not a press conference. It was a testimony of truth. A person who had just stepped out of a distorted system, now adjusting the lens for society to look back, not with tragedy nor with anger, but with such resolve that all excuses turned pale. A reporter from a local newspaper stood to her left, his voice clear but not hostile, asking, "Do you plan to file a lawsuit?" The entire room paused for a few seconds, not because it was a surprise, but because everyone understood that this was the question that had to be asked, and they were waiting for a response that could make tomorrow's headline. The woman standing in the middle of that room did not answer right away. She placed her pen on the table, tilted her head briefly as if weighing not the answer itself, but whether it was even necessary to say aloud what everyone already suspected. Then she looked up, her gaze steady, untouched by diplomacy or avoidance. "I will not sue." The response caused a few people in front to shift in their seats, clearly disappointed at losing a storyline easy to exploit. But she didn't give them a chance to redirect. She continued, "I will change what made suing the only option." The sound of that sentence was not loud, but its echo stopped every camera from panning away. In a system where wrongdoing was often pressed so far that the courtroom became the only outlet for truth, her response felt like a reset of the system's founding condition. "I'm not seeking compensation. I want to change the reason everyone thinks justice belongs to lawyers and trials." She offered no further explanation. The finality in her tone made any follow-up seem unnecessary. Those present in the room would later say they felt a clear boundary shift from someone who had been harmed to someone rebuilding. And that woman had crossed the line quietly but irreversibly. She gathered the thin file on the table, which included a few scene photos, an unreleased internal investigation record, and some early policy reform draft. No one stopped her for more questions. It seemed they all understood. Everything worth hearing today had already been said. The front doors remained open, where media vans and broadcast lights waited, but she didn't take that way out. Instead, she turned down a side corridor and descended the stairs. No security, no motorcade. Before leaving the room, she left a small piece of paper on the table, folded neatly like a letter without an address. On that paper, written in black ink, was a single line: "Justice has no name, only the faces of those who chose to look back." The line was unsigned, but no one questioned who had written it. She didn't need to be attached to the phrase like a slogan, because the way she exited, without even the sound of a closing door, made those words echo longer than any evening news segment. The next morning, in a few local reports, a new phrase began to appear: "Choose to look back." It was not a rallying cry, nor a platitude. It showed up in an essay by a student writing about silence, in an ethics lecture at the police academy, and even in the opening remarks of the moderator at a national law enforcement reform summit 3 weeks later. She answered no more questions from the media after that day. But the path she had set in motion continued, not built on chance, but on the small changed choices of each person who once turned away. No need for applause, just one by one, choosing to look back. When the press conference ended, she hadn't yet removed her blazer when a light knock came at the door of her temporary office. A young man, his gray shirt wrinkled with sweat, entered. He stood close to the edge of the carpet, his back slightly hunched, holding a small USB stick tightly in his hand. The nameplate on his shirt was crooked, reflecting the dim light, reading E. Monroe. "I'm a technician in the data room, responsible for monitoring storage and internal distribution since 21, he said. She nodded, not showing surprise. He swallowed hard, as though standing before an interrogation, even though he hadn't been charged. "I was instructed to adjust timestamps on some surveillance videos," he said slowly, "specifically the video in the third-floor interrogation room 6 years ago. They asked me to shift the timestamp by a few minutes. not to delete content, but enough to render the evidence useless. His voice wasn't exactly filled with regret. She remained seated, her hand resting on the edge of the desk, not taking any notes. "At the time, I didn't know what was happening in the footage," he continued. "But after I saw the Brody case being reopened, I checked again. That was the video where he was present. In that moment, she knew. If she chose to prosecute, this could trigger a series of chain investigations. But what mattered more was keeping the truth present, without bloodshed, without compensation." "Do you still have the original file?" she asked. Monroe nodded and extended the USB toward her, but he didn't release his grip. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he said. "I just want my name to no longer be buried at the bottom of a report as an invisible person." She took the USB, gently placing it on the glass table, then stood up. The light from the wall lamps cast a clear shadow on his face. "I won't prosecute," she said, "but your statement today will be filed in the public record. No anonymity, no abbreviations. Do you agree to that?" Monroe paused for a few seconds, then nodded, not because he was forced, but because he had come to understand the old silence could no longer secure a new place for him. As he left the office, she turned back to the bulletin board on the wall. Amid short reports and memos, she added a handwritten line: "The truth does not need to be paid for with blood, but it always requires someone brave enough not to adjust the time." In the afternoon briefing that day, she didn't mention Monroe. No one was called up to set an example, but in the internal email sent to all staff, she wrote clearly, "Starting next month, all data access and editing will be cross-checked between 3 departments, with an external representative, and no one will have the right to skip verification regardless of security reasons or higher directives." No one in the room objected, because they had seen what happens when a small edit is enough to erase an entire wrongdoing. That evening, Monroe sent a short message: "Thank you for not forgiving me, but for allowing me to exist." She didn't respond. But the next day, his name was added to the team responsible for recovering old data, the first team with unrestricted access to the entire internal video archive from the past 10 years. And in an office with no banners, no empty slogans, a copy of Monroe's confession was framed and hung on the wall next to the duty roster, not to make anyone remember his name, but to make everyone ask themselves, the next time we're asked to delete or adjust something, what will we do differently? The photograph came with no gold frame or bold declaration. It was printed in monochrome ink on coarse paper and taped directly to the old stone wall near the entrance. The image needed no explanation, because anyone who walked past it, whether officer, administrative staff, or new intern, would stop, not because it was shocking, but because it was too quiet to ignore. The blood in the photo did not sprawl. It was just a cracked arc, a few handspans wide, stretching across the peeled paint of the interrogation room wall on the 3rd floor. Someone once asked why that moment was chosen, instead of a clearer, more striking image. She answered simply, "Because this is the most honest trace." And the morning the photo was put up, there was no ceremony. She arrived early in plain clothes, a box cutter in hand, to press down the final edge of adhesive. When the first person entered the lobby, she had already stepped back, saying nothing, just watching. That person, a young officer newly transferred from another district, simply nodded in greeting, then paused a few seconds to look up at the wall, slowly, without expression. In a later meeting, someone suggested adding a label beside it to avoid confusion for visitors. She listened, then gently declined. "I don't need them to understand it our way. I need them to ask their questions. If they see it and still don't ask, then even with a caption, they won't read it." That same day, a high school group came to visit as part of a career program. Their guide, a seasoned sergeant, initially planned to use the side entrance, but when they passed through the main lobby, he stopped. The girl leading the group looked up and quietly asked, "What is this a picture of?" No one answered immediately. The sergeant, who had served 30 years, paused for a moment, then said, "This is a picture of a moment when we should have done differently." That afternoon, local newspapers ran stories about the blood photo at the precinct, alongside mixed opinions. Some criticized it as too extreme, damaging to the department's image. Others questioned whether such images were truly necessary in a public office. She offered no response. But in the internal memo sent to all staff at week's end, she wrote clearly, "Justice has no fixed image. It is not recorded in black and white, but in things not easily wiped away. And in a world where truth is often buried under procedure, we must leave behind marks that cannot be denied." The following week, police academies in 3 neighboring states requested copies of the photo, not for promotion, but to use in ethics classes. Other precincts began reviewing archived footage, cross-checking for scenes that had once been edited or cut. No one issued instructions, no directive came down, but the way one unpolished photo prompted entire departments to start looking back, that was what she had needed. By the end of the month, a single A4 paper appeared beneath the photo, unsigned. Scribbled in pencil, the line read, "I once sat in that room. I never thought I'd see it exposed." She read it, removed the paper, sealed it in plastic, and pinned it to the inside of the cabinet door by her desk. No one was asked to do the same, but everyone understood why she kept it. And just like that, the photo became the quietest presence in the building. No spotlight, no guard. It remained there like a fracture in glass, not visible from afar, but impossible to overlook up close. The small hall, set up temporarily in the old neighborhood, rarely hosted government meetings. The plastic chairs were tightly packed together. The ceiling fan creaked, but no one seemed to mind. The people came from various parts of the area, some in neat shirts, others still in their work uniforms. On the long table at the front, there were no microphones or banners, only a vacant spot in the middle, reserved for her. But she didn't sit down. She stood behind the last row of chairs, without introduction, without requesting a welcome. Her mere presence caused the hall to fall silent. The initially tense atmosphere gradually shifted into focused attention. An elderly woman stood up first, her voice hoarse and slow, recounting how she had witnessed her boyfriend being held at the station for 3 days without anyone informing her. When he was released, he said nothing for an entire week. I thought he was angry. Now I know that was his way of protecting himself from the memories. Next, a young man in his 30s took the floor, presenting a copy of the decision not to prosecute in a traffic accident case he was sure had been mishandled. One story followed another, each layer of silence being blown away, not by anger, but by the courage to face what had been locked away in their minds. A man, black, around 50, wearing a faded shirt, stood up near the end of the session. He didn't look around to see who was listening, nor did he introduce himself. He simply began with a sentence, as if speaking to himself. 10 years ago, my brother died because he was held wrongfully. Now I can speak." No one interrupted him. The room seemed to hold its breath, not wanting to break the fragile moment. He told his story briefly, without sensational details or specific evidence. But the way he spoke, with his hand clenched over his chest, made everyone feel that what he had lost went beyond just a family member. She didn't step up to speak, but after that story she walked toward the front table, took out an old leather notebook, placed it gently down, and opened a blank page. She then handed the only pen she had with her to the man. He took it, wrote a few lines, then placed it back on the table. No one asked to see what he had written, nor was anyone invited to read it aloud. She nodded lightly, then continued listening to the others share. The meeting ran nearly an hour longer than expected, but no one left early. A 6-year-old child dozed on their mother's shoulder. Some stood the whole time because there weren't enough chairs, yet still didn't take their eyes off the person speaking. And the most notable thing, there was no applause. Each story ended with a weighty silence, as if everyone was rewriting something in their hearts without needing to speak. On her way out of the hall, a young girl blocked her path, holding out an old photograph. In the photo was the middle-aged woman who had been sitting in the corner of the room, her face pale, a red mark from a tight grip on her wrist. The girl whispered, "This is my mother. She never told me. But today, my mother sat here." She took the photo, said nothing, and just placed her hand on the girl's shoulder as a silent acknowledgement. Back at the office, she placed the photograph in a separate drawer, along with the notebook from the meeting. She did not order a reinvestigation, nor did she issue a press release. But the next morning, the internal bulletin was updated with a single line: "The Community Memory Intake Program opens every Friday. No file limits, no time restrictions." The list was printed on plain paper. Each line held just a name, a date, and a brief description like "held overtime, lost contact during transfer, returned after losing consciousness." There were no accusatory words, no angry tone. The lines were not presented as evidence, but like whispers pieced together from years of silence. When the community representative stepped forward and placed the list in front of her, no one stood to applaud, but the room shifted. That silence wasn't a lack of response, it was the full agreement of those present. She took the list, flipped through quickly, and stopped at entry number 8, a name previously scattered across anonymous complaints from years ago. But this was the first time his name appeared with a date, time, and clear description. She did not ask who compiled the data. She did not request verification before responding. She simply looked up, met the eyes watching her, and said, "This is not a petition. This is a practical test of everything we've ever claimed to stand for." The man who had brought the list gave a small nod. No one smiled. No one showed enthusiasm. But when she returned to her office with the list, 3 people were already waiting. One was a retired technician, one a newly assigned intern, and one a former records clerk who had handled missing files 6 years ago. They had not received invitations, nor had they been summoned as witnesses. They came of their own accord, bringing memories and details that had once been overlooked. She did not begin with questioning, but with showing them the 17 cases. "Anything you remember matters," she said. Within 2 days, 9 entries were confirmed to show signs of irregularity. 4 names matched files that had been stamped late, 2 people had withdrawn complaints after receiving anonymous threats, and 3 others had been lumped into unrelated cases. Small details began to click together like long-hidden puzzle pieces. There was no major revelation, no dramatic whistleblower, but old stories began to move again, this time from the hands of someone who could direct them. She formed a small task group, no nameplate, no loud announcement. Only 4 people, each with a clear role: file review, intake of old statements, camera footage matching, and family contact. Instead of press conferences, she sent private letters to each household named on the list. In those letters, she never used the phrase, "we apologize." Instead, she wrote, "We will continue until something true is written back." After 3 weeks, 8 cases were officially reopened. Updates were made public under the System Error Correction Progress section on the internal site and forwarded to the State Office of Police Conduct Investigation. Some in the old guard grew uneasy with the process. No media, no reevaluation of political aims. But when a city council member asked if this approach risked more disruption, she answered, "It's not fear of reopening the past that should stop us. It's that if the past stays buried, the future won't have limits." The small sign outside her office still read, "Voluntary Testimony Intake." But people had started coming not out of fear or anger, but because it was the first time their loved ones could appear in a record unaltered. And to her, that was the first step toward making sure no one had to wait 10 years to tell the truth. When the proposal was presented at the closed meeting with the training board and representatives from the federal academies, she began with a simple question: can reflexes be retrained? The question made many people furrow their brows, especially a veteran officer with over 30 years in the field who had taught emergency response skills to thousands of trainees, immediately voiced his opposition. "We react to survive," he said, his voice firm as a command. "Analyzing the consequences is for the investigation department. Those on the front lines don't have that luxury." The room fell into a waiting silence. She didn't immediately counter, nor did she change the subject. Instead, she projected a video from last year's training session. where a trainee had shouted when an actor simulated pulling an unknown object from a bag. No one was harmed in that scenario, but the trainee's reflex was to immediately draw his gun and fire blank shots. He was praised for his speed, she said, but 3 weeks later, he submitted a resignation letter because he couldn't sleep, after realizing the threat was just a notebook. No one spoke. The veteran officer stared at the screen, silent. She moved on to the specifics. The new module wouldn't eliminate self-defense skills or slow down reactions, but it would add a stage of awareness between emergencies and misguided reflexes. In this stage, trainees would be taught to recognize cues from specific behaviors instead of vague judgments like a gut feeling something's wrong. She emphasized the correct reflex is not drawing the gun the fastest. It's knowing when not to draw the gun. A young trainee raised their hand to speak. She shared a field patrol experience where the instructor had said, if the suspect is a young black male, don't spend more than 2 seconds thinking. The room remained still, but she noticed the eyes starting to waver. She continued, the reflex is not wrong, but when that reflex is conditioned by bias, it's no longer a protective tool. It's a source of harm. The training board suggested a trial run of the module in the upcoming selection course. She agreed but added one condition. Each trainee must write a reflection after every exercise, no grading, just so they can learn to listen to themselves. The veteran officer still hadn't spoken, but when the meeting ended, he walked over to her and quietly said, I used to think I taught people how to react to survive. Now I think I should teach them how to survive and remain human. On the first day of the trial module, the scenarios were no longer simulated with violent scripts, but with tangled social situations. A single mother fumbling with paperwork, a young boy holding a glowing toy, an elderly person trying to unlock their car in a parking lot. Some trainees reacted by calling for an immediate check. Some hesitated, and some, instead of giving an order, began with the question, do you need help? At the end of the day, when reviewing the results, no one received a perfect score, but in the reflection writings, many lines made her stop and read more carefully. One trainee wrote, I realized I doubted the woman because she was wearing a hoodie, not because of her behavior. Another wrote, I'm afraid I won't react in time, but I'm also afraid that if I keep acting on instinct, I'll become a copy of someone I once tried to avoid. She didn't rely on charts or error rates. She quietly sent the reflection notes to the training department with a note for internal use. And deep down she knew reform begins the moment people start asking questions before acting. On the first day of the new training cycle, she skipped the speech. On the board, she wrote one line, who is the first person I suspect and why? No one wrote at first. She let the silence stay, no explanation, no time limit. The tension was familiar, but the lack of command made it different. It was just one request, look inward. Young recruit started writing. Others followed. She walked the aisles, reading faces. Some hesitated, some tapped their fingers, caught between instinct and thought. She wanted raw reflexes, not polished answers. Later, she projected replies. Man in a baseball cap. Woman of color with big bag. Teenager staring in parking lot. She circled the words, where's the threat? The room stayed quiet. One recruit said, it matched a robbery I saw. She nodded. Experience matters, but if it makes us assume the worst in everyone, we're using fear as evidence. Then she played a video. An officer pointing a gun at the wrong man in front of his child. The officer said, just protocol. She said, that's what happens when there's no human part. If we don't retrain, we teach kids their parents deserve harm for the color of a shirt. A recruit asked, if suspicion is automatic, how do we fix it? She smiled. Ask one more question before you act. Ask with your head, not your weapon. Before class ended, she asked them to write, next time, what will I do differently? Some said, slow down. Some said, don't judge by race. One wrote just 3 words, I will ask. She left as she came, in silence, but behind her was a room learning that power isn't for display. It's a chance to make things right. Change wouldn't come in a day, but with the right question, maybe they could start to see people again and learn again how to be human. That morning, the early sunlight streamed through the window, reflecting off the newly installed mirror in her office. Previously, this spot had been left empty for years, replaced with rule boards, strategy charts, and performance slogans. She had requested that everything be removed. The reason was simple: a place where power is granted without a space for self-reflection is not worthy of being called a command center. The mirror now hung flat against the wall, without a decorative frame, just a plain glass surface that reflected every face of those who entered. That day, as she adjusted her collar in front of the mirror, she noticed a faint white correction fluid mark at the lower edge, almost obscured by the light shining in. It was a short phrase: "I once looked away," a nameless confession left in the only place that forces one to face themselves every day. She didn't erase the mark, nor did she try to find out who wrote it, because she understood that what people dare to admit in silence is often more truthful than any public oath. In the afternoon meeting, she brought it up, not directly, but with an open-ended question. Who among us has stayed silent, knowing something was wrong? The room fell silent for a few seconds, long enough for everyone to understand this was not a rhetorical question. She didn't ask for hands to be raised, didn't ask for names to be recorded, but everyone knew that each person had just taken a mental roll call. After the meeting, a mid-level staff member knocked on her office door, bringing with him a copy of an old internal disciplinary report from 5 years ago when he was still an intern. The charge: failure to report misconduct by a superior. She accepted the copy, placed it on her desk, and simply said, "I don't need a reason. But if you choose to speak today, then tomorrow choose not to repeat it." In the afternoon, a group of trainees from the academy was allowed to tour the police station. While the guide was explaining the department layout, one trainee stopped in front of the mirror, bent down, and silently read the white inscription. She observed his reaction. He didn't ask questions, didn't laugh, just stood still for a few seconds, then looked up to see himself. She understood. That's how real change begins, from a silent moment that makes someone reflect, not because they are forced, but because they feel the need to. That evening, when she returned home late, she sat down to write her end-of-day report, but ended up writing only one line in her journal. Some things don't need to be printed in a report because they've already been printed in how people act tomorrow. Then she closed the notebook, looked at the living room mirror, an ordinary mirror with no inscription, but still the place that most clearly reflected the things the entire system was still learning to see. A few days later, the inscription on the mirror was erased. No one claimed to have done it, but she wasn't upset, because what mattered wasn't how long the inscription lasted, but that, at least once in life, someone who had remained silent had dared to write it where it could be seen. And because of that, maybe one day, when someone else looks into the mirror, they won't just see their face, but also see the responsibility they carry. The message was sent out in the form of an internal memo, without a red stamp, and a press conference. It was simply a short paragraph, posted on the bulletin boards of each unit across the state. Let the next person know where they went wrong. Don't paint everything white and say you've changed color. The words didn't use flowery language, didn't cite academic theories, or refer to any laws. But what made the entire department read it carefully was that everyone knew these words weren't meant to embellish a reform campaign, but a principle that was beginning to take shape. She didn't order the erased words to be cleaned. She didn't ask who wrote them. All she did was leave them as an intentional trace, a light touch from the past on the forehead of a system being renewed. In a meeting with unit heads, a few mentioned the mirror and the whiteout, half uneasy, half skeptical. Someone asked whether keeping something anonymous like that might confuse the public about the new direction. She simply said, "If a system fears the truth that once existed, then every step after becomes meaningless." From that day, many offices began reviewing themselves, not through KPI boards, but by digging into long-shadowed corners. A former patrol post in the western part of the state once sued for baseless, random checks, reopened its old file room. Over 200 unverified citations were found. She didn't call for punishment. Instead, she asked each team member to handwrite their explanation, and post it publicly in the main hallway, not to shame you, she told them, but to learn how to face what you once believed no one would ever check. A senior advisor who had served under 3 previous chiefs also spoke up. He didn't oppose the new path, but worried that keeping visible errors might erode trust among younger officers. She invited him to headquarters, not to argue, but to witness a class at the academy, where recruits were asked to analyze their reflexes and the roots of suspicion. One young woman read aloud, "I was taught to be alert around anyone wearing a hoodie at night, but I was never taught that alertness is not fear, and fear is not a right to control." After the session, the advisor said nothing more. He nodded quietly as he left, the doubt gone from his eyes. Meanwhile, in major cities, civil groups began holding forums on the memory of systems. They didn't use grand language, just brought attention back to blind spots in law enforcement history. Some regions that had wiped old records were now being asked to restore them, not to prosecute, but to serve as a foundation for future training. She stressed, no one grows from a blank slate. People grow when they know what was once hidden, and from a single line in whiteout at the mirror's edge, a new value system began. Not with paint, not by decree, but by the habit of keeping what was once concealed. That mirror wasn't cleaned, wasn't framed. It still hangs there, quietly reflecting all the truths the system had once refused to face. And to her, those old marks didn't stain the new image. They made the change more rooted, and therefore more real. More than a decade after the incident, the accusation surfaced just as the system began to reassess itself. The officer, once a training captain, didn't fully deny the accusations, offering only a weak defense. "It was a different time. I was just reacting." His words, though brief, caused discomfort. The term reaction, once a survival mechanism in this field, was now used to justify harm. She asked, "Reflexes are unavoidable, but who taught you to see the other person as a threat worth striking?" The question wasn't for blame, but to trace the internal culture. A review of old training materials revealed that most scenarios depicted suspects with specific traits, including people of color. The result, nearly 70%. What troubled her wasn't the number, but the long-standing unconscious bias. She didn't impose immediate punishment on the officer, but instead read a letter from a former trainee who had stayed silent years ago. "I told myself I wasn't involved, but I stayed silent." These words were enough. The price of silence not only affects victims, but also those who witnessed it. Before leaving the meeting, she requested a special lecture for all instructors, beginning with the question, what is the correct reflex, and when does it become an excuse for uncontrolled behavior? The lecture, held quietly and without media attention, was well attended. A young officer said, "We can't erase all mistakes, but we can stop teaching recruits to repeat them." She simply nodded, believing true change comes not by erasing the past, but by confronting it openly. He stood in the room holding a report that had been erased from the system years ago, now printed again with red marks highlighting the missed sections. The room was silent. She didn't speak, just looked at him, not with judgment, but with a reminder of what needed to change. He read. At first, his voice was stiff, trying to stay professional, but by the part where the victim described being shoved against the wall, then forced down over the sink, his pace slowed. Each line in the report lacked poetry, had no metaphors, but when heard in the voice of the person who had once shaped it, that plainness hit harder. The final line, "I couldn't scream, but I knew I was being punished, not for a mistake but for existing," dropped into the room like an unsigned indictment. He stayed silent for a while. She didn't ask him to apologize. She didn't ask anyone in the room to comment. Instead, she asked one question. Did you hear your voice in that? Not the sound, but the tone. Not to identify, but to take responsibility. Because only the reader truly senses which parts they skimmed past and which they helped create, knowingly or not. The council made no immediate ruling. She proposed a temporary step. The officer must attend all hearings of complaints from the past 10 years without speaking, just listening, transcribing every word. Not as punishment, but to relearn how to hear without adding his voice. Because in the first contact between power and the public, Speech isn't just a tool. It's a living record of position, nature, and intent. When the reports were reprinted and posted on the investigation room walls, she chose to hang the excerpt he read at the doorway, a place people pass first, not to remember failure but to reset the standard. A small line was added beneath. Truth doesn't need editing, just the right voice, at the right time. It wasn't poetic, but it was sharp. It named no one, yet made everyone pause before speaking. That day, some younger officers asked for full copies, not to share, but to study. One told her, "We thought we understood protocol, but protocol doesn't teach you how to read silence." She didn't reply right away. She nodded, then said, "From now on, every training will start with an old report. Not to judge, but to ask, if I read this in my voice, could I still believe I had no part in it?" In her office, a photo of the officer reading the report was placed beside the old interrogation room wall. Two images, one man looking down at paper, one faded bloodstain, unlabeled, yet louder than any speech ever written. Together, they reminded the system that justice doesn't start with calling others to change. It starts when someone dares to hear their voice again, not as one who enforces the law, but as one who once stepped away from it. That morning, as headlines flooded in, "Inspiring female police chief, symbol of racial justice," she laid the newspapers flat on her desk, underlined the praise, then struck through each one in red. The slash wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate. What disturbed her most wasn't criticism, it was selective praise. When a black woman's face was used to comfort the public into thinking change had already happened, it made the system's rot easier to ignore. She declined every interview, withdrew from every panel, and sent only a brief memo to the force. "I don't need praise. I need you to fix yourselves." No slogans, no explanation. But those 9 words echoed across break rooms, locker halls, and morning briefings. For people long used to deflecting blame, the message landed harder than any public apology. A week later, a civil society group proposed building a statue of her outside the headquarters. She refused. Instead, she asked that the funds go to a new training facility, one that recreated the very situations where past failures happened. Every room would be designed so that trainees couldn't pass if they held on to old instincts. "Don't put mistakes behind glass for tourists," she told the board. "Build something that forces you to feel what went wrong." At a closed meeting, senior officers warned she was alienating herself. The public needed a person to represent change. She answered simply, "If change depends on one person, it won't survive that person." Then she added a note to every article about her in the archives. "None of this matters if 3 months from now, no one remembers the names of those who stood outside, demanding to be seen." Outside, headlines painted her as the woman who rejected the spotlight. She didn't care. Her focus stayed on the backlog of old files and whether training was altering how officers understood power. One afternoon, she received a package from an out-of-state high school. Essays from 11th grade students answering the question, "What would you ask Chief Adrian Rowe?" One student wrote, "Are you scared being the only one who didn't stay silent?" Another asked, "If I were held just for how I look, would you believe me?" She read each page, then sent back one line, "I'm not afraid to be the first to speak up. I'm afraid of being the last one who still believes it matters." That was why she never let herself become a statue, because statues stop people from asking questions. They invite worship, not accountability. And what the system needed wasn't another ICO. It needed more people willing to bow their heads and admit they looked away when they shouldn't have. When a major talk show requested a live interview, she didn't send a rep. She returned a handwritten note. "Ask the last person who was beaten, not me." The note landed on the host's desk. The segment was canceled without a word. At headquarters, she walked the long hallway, once plastered with empty slogans. On the bulletin board, she took down an old poster, flipped it over, and rewrote the motto, "We serve and protect." But this time, beneath it, she underlined the last words in red. "Everyone, no exceptions." People paused longer than usual when passing it, not because it was new, but because it corrected what had always been quietly missing. The next day, a young officer visited her office. He said the sign reminded him of a time he ignored a homeless man kicked out of a post office for looking safe. She didn't praise him. She didn't log it. She only asked, "What would you do now if it happened again?" A question meant not to shame, but not to forget. She continued revising the academy curriculum. Vague hypotheticals were replaced with real hidden cases. Every clip, every report line is shown not to dramatize failure, but to name it. "I don't need a new program," she told the faculty. "I need a way to teach that leaves people remembering the face of the one they misjudged." When a national reform conference nominated her for a top 10 reformers list, she declined. Her written reply was shared internally. "I haven't changed the system. I've just asked people in it to stop looking away." She restored internal suggestion boxes, directed to her desk. Some letters were angry, some were written by kids about detained parents. She didn't respond to each, but those voices shaped her decision, not as evidence, as signs that healing hadn't happened yet. At a quarterly meeting, someone asked if dismantling tradition might erode public trust. She paused, then said, "If tradition keeps people from telling the truth about being wrongfully held, then losing it is rebirth, not collapse." At day's end, when the lights dimmed across the building, she walked past the board. The words were still there. Everyone, no exceptions. She didn't stop for photos. She didn't need to. She just walked by, reminding herself, only when a sentence is rewritten to change behavior does it begin to mean something. One autumn morning during Life Skills Week, a primary school class had an activity called "Who Do I Trust When I'm in Danger?" The teacher gave out crayons and paper, asking each child to draw someone they'd trust most in an emergency. Most drew parents or doctors. But a girl in the front row raised her hand and said, "The policewoman in the red uniform." She didn't know the name, only remembered how that officer had helped a classmate who'd fallen near the gate while others walked by. "He didn't talk much," the girl said, "just sat with him, gave him water, and waited." This story made its way to the police chief during a regular meeting as part of community feedback. She didn't react, only asked for thanks to be sent to the school and parents. But later the image of that little girl raising her hand stayed with her, far longer than any press praise ever had. The next day she showed up at the school without notice, in her red uniform, not for the ceremony, but so children could spot her. As she stepped into the yard, the kids were playing tag. One saw her and shouted. Soon she was surrounded. A boy asked, "Do you have a water bottle today?" She smiled and pulled out candy. "Something sweeter," she said. Inside, the principal suggested inviting her to speak to students about safety. She declined and proposed something else. Have them draw "the person who makes me feel the safest," without specifying profession, uniform, or gender. "Let's see whether it's the badge they trust or the behavior," she said. A week later, the drawings arrived. Some showed people in uniforms. Others looked like parents or neighbors. But one drawing stood out. A simple bench with the words, "The person sitting here listened to me when I was silent." No figure, no label, just the outline of someone staying, not leaving. The chief asked to display the drawings in the police station next to a photo of the old interrogation room. No titles, no captions, just contrast between silence once enforced and trust slowly rebuilt. That morning, her secretary left a handmade card on her desk. It had a pencil drawing of a bench with one line underneath. "You sit there, but the wrong one is no longer sitting." She looked at it for a long time, then pinned it to the lower right corner of the board, where the morning light always landed. No one noticed it that day, but by noon a young officer stopped in front of it, didn't speak, just nodded, like he'd found an answer that didn't need to be asked. That afternoon, in a routine internal meeting, a community coordinator said the outreach office had been receiving more anonymous letters since the student art display. Some were thank you notes, others were complaints, but all came directly, no social media, no filters. "They write like someone here will read it," someone noted. She reviewed the minutes from the last meeting and pointed to the item on improving public feedback. Then she said, "We don't need a filter, we need an unlocked door." She proposed setting up a mailbox in the lobby with a sign, "We will read this, and if needed, we will respond." Some raised security concerns. She simply said, "I'll take responsibility." A few weeks later, the box was installed. At first, people just glanced at it. But soon, slips began appearing. Some were shaky accounts of old events, others were just raw thoughts. One read, "I saw my brother pulled from a car. I never knew why. I was 12. Another simply said, "I don't need an apology. I need a promise. This won't happen again." Every weekend she opened the box herself, read every note, and marked patterns in a notebook. Not all were factual, but what mattered was that people were willing to speak. In later meetings, she changed the format. Instead of opening with performance stats, they'd start with 3 letters from the box, not for publicity, but as a reminder. This work wasn't about satisfying supervisors, but about repairing the silence once treated as normal. The card with the bench stayed on the board. Each morning, the sunlight blurred the pencil lines a little more, like time helping to soften the past without erasing it. And she knew that in a system used to slogans and medals, maybe it's the smallest, quietest gestures that leave the marks that matter most. The email arrived at 3 in the morning, with an empty subject line and a sender address consisting of an untraceable string of characters. The message was brief, just one sentence. "I witnessed it, and I haven't slept a peaceful night since." Though no name was provided, she knew immediately this was not from an ordinary citizen. Each word carried a unique kind of torment, the kind that only those who have worn a uniform for too long understand, long enough to realize that silence is also part of the system. She read the line over and over in the darkness of her office, under the dim light of her desk lamp. There were no specific details about the incident, no dates or witnesses, but with her experience in hundreds of hours of interrogations and conversations, she understood. What the sender needed wasn't an investigation mechanism, but an opportunity to face themselves. So she responded with just one sentence: "Do you want to do something before you close your eyes for good?" She didn't wait for a reply, but a week later, at the public mail area in the lobby of the headquarters, the receptionist found a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a 5-page handwritten statement. The opening line read, "I was on guard in the south hallway on the 11th of August, 2012. The rest described in detail the scene of a teenager being pushed against a wall, subdued with a rifle butt, and the crude remarks intentionally left out of the report. The writer admitted to witnessing the entire incident, but not intervening because a superior officer was present. And because he had thought, that kid did look suspicious, she instructed the data review team to reopen the punch card logs and shift schedules from that day. After several days of cross-referencing digital files and paper reports, the identity of the sender was revealed. She didn't issue a summons, nor did she send a warrant, and instead, she returned a typed copy of the statement, attached with a personal letter. "If you still wear the uniform, I'll ask you to read this aloud to the entire team, but since you've left the service, I'll leave it up to you. Bring it to the family of the victim, or let them come to you." 3 days later, the former officer appeared at the police station's gate unannounced. He didn't enter the main office, but went straight to the civil affairs office, requesting to meet with a relative of the victim from over a decade ago. When the victim's family member came out, he silently handed over the envelope and said only one sentence: "I'm here to confirm what your brother said was true." The news didn't spread, nor was it picked up by the media, but within the department it was a quiet shock, a seemingly small act, yet it struck at the core of what had always been the foundation of the system, the belief that time could make mistakes disappear. And to her, that mattered more than any television interview. A few weeks later, during a training session for new officers, she shared the story without mentioning any names. When one trainee asked, "Was he forgiven?" she simply shook her head and answered softly, "Forgiveness isn't my job. I've only done the one thing I could to ensure no one has to live with torment for 10 years. Thinking they were protecting what was right." The young officers fell silent. Some wrote something in their notebooks, and she knew. A single question sent at 3 in the morning sometimes is enough to open a door that had been shut for a long time. He came on a Monday morning, bringing a signed copy of the statement. He looked tired, but didn't avoid anyone's gaze, walking slowly down the hallway as though he had prepared for what was to come a long time ago. She didn't summon him, nor did she issue an order. But somehow he understood that standing up, moving toward the truth, even if late, was the most necessary thing he could do to save himself. The conversation happened in a small briefing room. No cameras, no lawyers, no outside pressure. He spoke calmly, like recounting something long buried. No excuses. He described how a boy was dragged into the interrogation room against protocol, how fists hit the wall more times than recorded, and how he sat just outside, knowing but doing nothing. When he said, "I thought silence would make it go away. It never did," she simply nodded and walked out. Another officer took him to the special intake unit, not for discipline, but for those ready to confront their past through real action. 2 hours later, the advisory board ruled no prosecution. His actions didn't meet the legal threshold, but would have triggered disciplinary action if he were still active. Because he confessed voluntarily, he entered a pilot program she had proposed. He would speak to every new training class for 6 months. No notes, no edits, no pretending he had done the right thing. At his first session, he stood alone. No mic, no slides. She watched from the back. Some trainees looked bored until he described turning away while a boy gasped for air behind a glass wall. Then the room went still. When he left, one trainee stood and said, "I'll remember your face, so I don't become you." Back at her office, she circled the date in red, not as a milestone, but a reminder. Sometimes healing means forcing the truth into daylight before others distort it. And in that quiet reckoning, a door opened, not from rules, but from memory that survived a system built to forget. On the first day of the semester, a student pointed to the empty wall in the large hall and asked, "Why is it blank?" She stepped forward and replied, "Because no one's been honest enough to fill it." The room fell silent, not confused but aware. That wall had once held honors and slogans, but after an internal investigation, many images were removed. Rather than replace them, she left the wall bare, a space not awaiting celebration, but reflection. That afternoon, she walked the hallway with a retired instructor who reminisced about the academy's proud years. She didn't argue, only asked, "If those years were so right, why are we sitting here now?" They stopped in front of the wall. She said, "You don't erase the past with fresh paint. You face it until someone's ready to write the truth." The next day, students proposed painting a mural, a justice scale held by diverse hands. She approved with one request: leave space in the center. Justice isn't complete if anyone is left behind. The first brushstroke came from a student once suspended for reporting bias. His hand trembled, but he painted anyway. Some alumni protested. She didn't reply. When asked why, she said, "Sometimes the right thing is to let others see themselves in the space they ignore." That quote appeared later on a hallway board. No name attached, but students stopped to read it. A week later, the law enforcement history class met in front of the mural. The instructor asked, "If you could add one thing, what would it be?" After the silence, one student said softly, "A place for those who were silenced." She heard from the hall, said nothing, and walked on. Because sometimes a wall isn't for decoration, it's for unlearning. A year passed. No one explained the wall, but everyone knew its meaning. Then one morning, a small handwritten line appeared at the bottom. She didn't answer, and because of that, we had to learn how to listen. No one knew who wrote it. No cameras, no witnesses. She saw it, read it once, and walked away. No meeting, no memo. The wall had spoken for itself. People came to see the line. Some were moved. Some who once opposed the blank wall began writing again, about past harms never fully named. In classes on critical thinking, instructors cited the line as a lesson in silence and accountability. Not everything has to be explained to be understood. Students later proposed preserving the quote in cast metal. She didn't sign off. Instead, she wrote, "If you do it, don't do it for me. Do it for those who never spoke." The Academy approved it without debate. Within weeks, the line was embedded, quiet, close to the wall, visible only up close. The unveiling was quiet. No speeches. Among the few present was someone once suspended for speaking up. They touched the metal, nodded once, and left. No one said her name. No one praised her, because the point wasn't a tribute, it was a truth, with no finish line. She wasn't there. She was teaching. When told of the ceremony, she asked only, "Did they read it aloud?" The answer was yes. She moved on with the lecture, the difference between reflexes shaped by law and those shaped by fear. Later that day, someone wrote the same line on the back of the library's most borrowed book, not to repeat, to remind. Every system needs to pause and ask, have we listened yet? And if not, where will we hear the first voice? Raw, unanswered, unfiltered, just to understand. On her final morning in office, there was no farewell, no ceremony. The station operated as usual. Some might say she left quietly, but those who had worked with her understood. The silence was deliberate, the only form of respect she would accept. No spotlight, no applause. She arrived early, as always. Same simple shirt, same tied-back hair, but this time the folder in her hand was empty. She walked the halls, nodded to a few familiar faces, then entered her office for the last time. No handover, no statements. She sat at her desk, looked once at the sunlit bulletin board, and pulled out a leather notebook. It was the only thing she left behind. No statistics, no strategy. Just one line on the first page. Justice does not speak loudly, but it still reaches those who need it. No name, no signature, but everyone who read it knew it was meant for them. Later, a young officer found the notebook. He stood for a while, reading the line, unsure whether to shelve it or leave it. He put it back exactly where it was. Her departure made little noise. No farewell emails, no headlines. But in the days that followed, reports were written more carefully. Complaints were handled with more attention. People looked at themselves differently in the mirror. Small shifts, quiet but real. The HR board left a corner of the internal bulletin board empty, not for tribute, but as a reminder that the most powerful legacies don't need photos or slogans. In new training sessions, recruits were asked to remember one principle. Don't shout to prove you're right. Act so others know it without a word. It wasn't in the textbook. It was added by a volunteer who had seen her first day. Now he was teaching what she had never named. The notebook remained, now protected by a clear cover. No one wrote in it, but everyone knew it was still being continued, every day, in how they worked and who they became. She left through the iron gate without a sound. No cameras, no crowd, just the quiet of a job finished. Across the street, a girl held her mother's hand. She watched as the woman in red passed. "Is that the lady from the video, Mom?" The mother smiled, wiping ice cream from her daughter's chin. "No," she said, "that's the one who made it so no one needs to record anymore." That response wasn't symbolic, it was instinct, from someone who had once gripped a phone tightly, afraid no one would believe what they saw. But today, at least for her, the fear had softened. She didn't look back, but she might have smiled, not from pride, but from knowing change isn't counted in reforms. It's in small moments, when a mother relaxes her grip, when an officer's presence brings calm. She took the long bus home, one that passed through old streets filled with difficult memories. The walls, once covered in protest, now held colors not meant to erase, but to tell the story anew. At a stop, an old man boarded. He looked at her, then sat opposite. No greeting, just quiet. Before he got off, he stood, nodded. "A thank you," she nodded back. That day, no headlines ran, but inside the station, people remembered. Someone had left without needing a portrait on the wall, because the way others looked at the job had changed. And maybe that's what justice means. Not in honoring the good, but in making sure no one has to fear anyone again. The story didn't end with applause or praise, but with the gaze of a child and the whisper of a mother who once had to clutch her phone to prove what was right. The woman in the red shirt didn't need to become a symbol, because what she left behind wasn't fame, but the ability to make an entire system reflect on itself. And the final lesson was simple. Justice doesn't need to be grand. It only needs to be strong enough so that those who come after don't have to fight against what should have been there to protect them.